Before it gets lost into the void, I want to tell about a letter that got written to the Denver Post years ago. It could have been as long ago as 1947 or 1948. It was apparently written in answer to a letter that had been written earlier, and judging by this letter, the earlier one seems to have been written by a woman who was complaining that when her husband got drunk, he'd knock her around. The woman who wrote the letter I read said that she had had the same problem. She said she only weighed about 100 pounds and her husband weighed close to 200 pounds. She said for years he'd go out on Friday night and Saturday night and get drunk, and then he'd come home and beat her up, and then he'd fall asleep on the bed with his clothes on. There came a night when he beat her up, and when he had stopped, she said, "I owe you one." When he fell asleep, she went outside and brought in a piece of 2x4, and she started pounding on him with it. Of course, he woke up right away, and he beat her up again, and she said, "I owe you one." She said that in no time at all, she had him afraid to go to sleep. Then he began to see that it was okay to go to sleep if he hadn't beaten her up. So he stopped. Considering the number of years that had gone on, the stopping was really quick. She said she hoped that her solution would encourage the other woman to look for a solution because it was not hopeless. The two principles involved were consistency and perseverance.
She makes it feel like you're sitting around a dinner table, and yet this is a public place. Anybody who walks in here could feel they've almost known her before.
Bobbie's childhood during the 1930s Depression was poor. Her mother and Irish father separated when she was 10 years old. Her mother's family were cattle farmers and sharecroppers in Lubbock, Texas.
My mother's people were incredible storytellers, so that when there was no electricity, and as it would get dark, they'd put kerosene lamps out on the table. And everyone would sit around the table, and the children, if they could get by with it, would be leaning against the wall, sitting on the floor. But of course, as soon as the adults' attention was caught by any of the children were sent to bed. But until that happened, there were these ongoing stories, so that those stories, I realized, got honed through this process of, it was an editorial process, effectively. Finally, those stories were told in the same words. The old man used to wake up in the middle of the night and think he couldn't breathe. He used to have the idea that at night all the oxygen in the room would get used up and he was going to die in his sleep. Anyway, he used to wake up and just run snorting for the window and throw it up and stick his head out and take big breaths like he'd just come up out from under the water. Well, this one night, he woke up almost too late. That is, he didn't think he could make it to the window, so he reached down and he grabbed up one of his shoes and he heaved it toward the window. There was all the crash of the glass breaking, and he figured he'd saved his life, but the next morning he'd just broke the mirror over the chest of drawers. Another thing, you know how he used to shove Vicks up his nose? When he had a cold, he'd rub Vicks all over his chest and on his temples, and then for good measure he'd stuff it up his nose and swallow some. Well, one night he woke up with a cold and headed for the drawer where the Vicks was kept, went through that whole routine, but the next morning he'd just used up a jar of white shoe polish. I think that was my grandfather, who lived entirely too long. Too mean to die, I think, is the way it goes. When Olaf and I married and went to Denmark, and then from Denmark we went to London, and by that time he had overstayed his leave, so they'd sent someone else out to West Africa. So we stayed in London a year, And during that time I went to the Slade and kept on with painting.
When studying art at the University of New Mexico in 1950, Bobbie met and married Olaf, a Danish architect. After they lived in London, he was employed by the United Nations during the Korean War. Bobbie lived in Tokyo, where she continued her studies. In the mid-1950s, they divorced.
I went back to the States, and with diplomatic immunity, that meant that he didn't have to give me any money of any kind, so that I was the sole support of myself and my 2 children. And I was doing this midnight to 6 job and leaving my children with my mother in the daytime when I would go to school for these classes. Sharing leaves me cold, but the first time I heard challenge, when I would have said problem, it went straight to my heart. A word that lets you be desolated, but implies options. Every destruction, an opportunity. I don't know what my character would have been if I hadn't had so many opportunities to improve it. I think the real difference with Creeley was I really fell in love with him, and I fell in love with him pretty much on sight. And I didn't know really what his background was, and I knew he was a writer, but I really liked his looks. And he continues to be a brilliant talker, and I adore talk. I think talk is one of the major sensual experiences. And when I sight someone who can talk, I just want to stay. And I stayed for 18 years. Therefore, I mean, that marriage went on, like most marriages that do end. That one went on for about 5 years too long. But in the early years of it, it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary.
No. No, whither thou goest.
Robert Creeley is now a widely known writer in the United States. When Bobbie met him, he was a school teacher with a growing reputation as a poet. In 1959, he became tutor to the children of coffee plantation owners in Guatemala. This job gave him more spare time to write. They drove 3,000 miles to get there.
A part of what was going on there, you realize, was a kind of glamoured notion of oneself. If one was going to be poor and living in hardship, being poor and living in hardship in Guatemala still somehow came within the artistic job description, whereas being poor and living in hardship in 6 miles south of Albuquerque, New Mexico, didn't.
The stay in Guatemala was the source for Bobbie's novel, The Sanguine Breast of Margaret. The experiences of the central character, Margaret Doherty, are drawn from Bobbie's own.
When Creeley and I were together, it was very acceptable to him that I should do painting, and it was not acceptable to him that I should do writing. So he would find me writing, and he would explain to me that he couldn't live in a house with a woman who wrote. So that and one of the dilemmas of that is we'd have fierce arguments. And of course what I was arguing for was my right to write badly, which is a really lousy position. I wasn't a good writer, and here I was suddenly disrupting the household, and he would drink a lot and break furniture and things to make it clear that he was serious. And I was in the position of effectively being responsible for all of this responsive behavior on his part and disrupting the household in order to fight for the right to be doing writing at a time when I was very aware of it, that my writing was not good. And I decided to write secretly.
The book she started in secret took 20 years to write. The Sanguine Breast of Margaret was published by North and South in 1992. In the early days, friends sent her manuscripts to publishers, and she used pseudonyms for publication. In the mid-1970s, she was writing under her own name. She has published several books of poetry and short stories, and 2 novels.
The dinner table topic was death and dying. It seemed people died in wholesale lots in this place. Mildred and Barney were comparing how many had died so far this year with how many died last year. At Los Cedros de San Juan, where the Doughertys were to live, 23 children already counted in the most recent epidemic of whooping cough. Our kids have had their shots for whooping cough, Margaret said, relieved. The conversation moved smoothly onto the current typhoid epidemic. Mildred, it seemed, was convalescing. She laughed. Tony thinks Indians get typhoid because they're Indians. He says it isn't a white man's disease. I don't know what he thinks that makes me. When the rain stopped, sounds from the street could be heard. A coughing, like vomiting. Margaret looked out. A small girl was doubled over, her face red with the seizure, her mouth running a stream of saliva onto the road, onto her clothes. Her lungs had emptied all the air and fought to pull more in. She shook in a spasm, caught between the cough that would not stop and the battle her lungs were making. Farther along the road, the child's mother, impassive, a small baby held in her rebozo, tied onto her back, waited. When the coughing slowed and the child could breathe, when she was normal enough to continue, they walked downhill to the baker's. Oscar, Barney's office worker, made a bus trip to the city. Returning home, his bus had a flat tire just as it left the city limits. The passengers climbed out to wait while the driver dealt with it. When the tire had been changed, they reboarded. While many of them were still in the aisle, a second bus passed, its horn blaring. Without a thought, the driver on the stopped bus raised his foot from the clutch and was in pursuit. The people still in the aisles were thrown to the floor. Bus number 2 stopped to let off passengers, and Oscar's bus passed it, horn blaring. In the flush of his simply won triumph, the driver called an apology back over his shoulder. It was important to the scheduling, he explained, that he be ahead of the other bus. When he stopped for a passenger, the other bus passed him, exultant. The dilemma was clear. He passed the second bus when it stopped to let someone off, and when a passenger on his bus wanted off, he parked in the road, dead center. The other bus could not pass. The other driver blasted the air with his horn to no avail, then slung his door open. He was coming out. Oscar's bus, its passenger disgorged, roared away, and was stopped by a slow truck. Bus number 2 passed in the oncoming lane. The passengers and their stops became cursed objects. They came hurtling off with whatever of their luggage they could carry, a salvaging operation. What they could not grab and carry, they saw leave in the departing bus. Whichever bus was behind began to take extraordinary risks in order to pass. Oncoming traffic was driven off the road at the sight of 2 buses coming at them, neck and neck. Now, whenever the second bus passed, its driver would cut in short to crash the rear back corner of his bus against the front corner of the bus where Oscar's driver sat. The next thing was Oscar's driver stopped stopping. The passengers on his bus and on the other bus, when that driver grasped the new strategy, were made prisoners, insignificant cargo. The driver of bus number 2 made a decision. He got just far enough ahead to have the time to stop his bus across the road. He opened the door and climbed out. He was a big man, very powerful. Oscar's driver was smaller but game, given the length of chain he took in his hand as he left his own bus. He walked to where the other man stood and proceeded with his chain to beat the other man to the ground. When the larger man's assistant tried to join the fight, a passenger from Oscar's bus pulled a gun from a hip holster and said, "This will be a fair fight." Apparently the chain served in his imagination to equalize the difference in size. The fight over, Oscar's driver climbed back into his bus with the passengers who decided to try it again, drove around the end of the parked bus, and continued on to be passed and bumped only minutes later by the other driver, blood pouring down his face. When Oscar's driver resumed the race, the passenger with the gun lurched his way forward along the aisle and insisted, "You will begin to stop," holding his gun to the driver's head. The other bus, victorious, disappeared out of their sight down the road. The bus became a bus again, and Oscar arrived home to tell the tale. In the city, the same week, a drunk was put off a city bus, hauled forcibly by the driver through the door, shoved out. As the bus drove away, that drunk pulled a gun from somewhere, began shooting after the bus. The driver stopped, put the bus in reverse gear, came backwards against the man, carrying him up over the curbing, crushing him to death against a building.
Since 1987, Bobbie has taught on the writing program at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, and runs the Bijou Theater there. She also organizes the Naropa Summer Writing Program of readings and workshops.
Talking to Connie Pickard, I said, "Remember all those years of cooking for all those people who came to see the famous person, and it would come lunchtime and they would not go home?" I think it has been a fairly consistent shock and trauma to all of those men to have had those women, in fact, become writers. A certain amount of terror there, which I think is well-deserved. No resources, no way to make a move that matters. The belief that large things must happen, and over the edge is the only way to go. Take the poor amoeba that wants to make a move. Every peripheral bit is a potential leg. Outshoots on 3 different directions, 3 different sides, each thinking, "Excelsior!" And then they haul back in, and 2 more shoot out elsewhere. And all that jiggling, does it think it's moving right along? No thought. Just another creature dependent on all that interior destiny stuff that moves lemmings to the edge of the cliff and over. No thought needed to go all the way down to splat. And what does the human mind do that's any different? Not what it thinks it does. The mind goes along for the ride, explaining all the way.